Welcome to the Not Just AI podcast, a show where we explore how technology, data, and human insight come together to drive the future of decision intelligence and automation. My name is Pranay Agrawal. I'm your host, co-founder and CEO at Fractal, where our mission is to power every human decision in the enterprise using AI engineering and design. Joining us today are two visionary leaders, very complementary in their areas of interest around AI transformation in the financial services industry and customer experience. Our first guest this evening is Alyson Clarke. She's a principal analyst at Forrester. In her role, she's one of the most respected voices in the industry on AI-based transformation for the financial services, customer experience, digital banking, and trust in financial services. Joining her on the panel is Deep Srivastav, Chief AI Officer at Franklin Templeton, which is one of the world's largest asset managers. In his role, Deep is focused on using AI-based transformation to drive better portfolio intelligence, personalized customer experience, distribution strategy, and operational efficiency. Welcome, both of you on the show, and let's get started. Alyson, Deep, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us. Let me start with the first question for you, Alyson. Alyson, you made the point that firms often confuse technology deployment with real transformation. So from your perspective, what does true AI transformation in financial services mean when you look at end-to-end processes, business models, and full ROI, as opposed to just a technology upgrade?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's interesting. I get asked a lot about AI transformation, and I've been thinking a lot about, where it's going, particularly in financial services. And I think when I look at AI transformation, I see parallels with digital transformation and everything that happened for the last decade or so in digital transformation. I see, with digital transformation, I'll be honest, for 99% of firms, at least in financial services, digital transformation failed. And it failed because people didn't actually transform. They digitized what the organization already did, but they didn't really change their business outcomes. They didn't change their business model, sorry. They didn't change processes and the way they do business and the way they make money. And I see the same thing happening with AI. I see a lot of use cases being chased as opposed to outcomes. I see this focus on cost reduction and productivity. And we saw this with digital transformation too in the early days. The focus was all about those things instead of being transformative and growing revenue. I think, the real kind of simple test to kind of say, is a financial institution undergoing true AI transformation, is that if you remove the AI, would the business model still fundamentally work the same way? Now, if the answer is yes, it's just an IT upgrade. If the answer is no, then you're looking at real transformation.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think that's quite deep. So I take three things over here. One, enterprise-wide, right? Moving from task flows to decision flows. Second is putting AI at the center of the business model, and which means that the business model change and then the right metrics. But the last thing that you said, that if I took AI out, would I be doing something? I mean, because I put in AI, am I doing something fundamentally different?
If the answer is no, all you've done is an IT upgrade.
Okay,
yeah.
Excellent, great. And we'll go a little deeper into all of these areas. Let me thank you very much. Let me pivot to Deep. And so Deep, from your perspective, you have lived this the shift inside Franklin Templeton, and you've led a lot of transformation and changes over there. So when you look at AI through the lens of asset and wealth management, what changes when the goal becomes transformation? What changes when it is transformation rather than, say, layering new tools onto existing workflows?
No, good point, Pranay. Alyson, loved everything that you said. I do agree that one, even before I talk about what changes happen, I think one, I just want to lay out what happens when you're thinking use cases. With use cases, there's a lot of fun. There's a lot of euphoria. There's a lot of high that happens every time you get a use case, right? So Teams congratulate each other. There's a lot of excitement of something new that came together, and that keeps growing. That keeps a lot of momentum. That creates a lot of positivity in the system. And we experienced all of that, right? We did a lot of that in this whole AI phase, where there was a point in time when we kept doing and kept getting good results and kept adding more and more, and suddenly we were drowning in like 400 use cases, right? So that's the fun of use cases. They get everybody together, they get everybody aligned. Um, but then, to Alison, exactly to your point, they don't do necessarily start impacting that shift to the business model, right? And at some point in time, we had to take a step back and take a hard call when we moved from those 400 use cases to say that no, we will go after four transformations. And that 400 to 4 was not an easy shift, right? You can imagine the amount of tension it created in the organization. But we selected areas and we started thinking about them, that how can we transform these four processes? And that was that shift in the goal, Pranay, that you were talking about, right? That our job is to think, how will these processes happen significantly differently when AI comes in? And almost always it's, the moment you start on transformation, it's never one technology or one capability, right? So the moment you start thinking about that, it was AI, then it was digital, it was the change in the processes, how we are thinking about it, all of it starts to happen. And that felt good. But I think I also want to point out that that's pretty hard, because when you're saying transformation, what do you mean? At the outset, you cannot describe what is that end state that you're trying to get to, because nobody knows that. The technology teams do not know that, the business teams do not know that. And this confusion of what is that, if we are trying to go from point A to point B, one, we don't know point B. And two, we have absolutely no idea how we'll get from point A to point B, right? So both of those things start creating a completely new set of challenges. The vision and the time horizon start to shift, because now you're talking multi, months, at times years. Um, it sucks away some of that euphoria, that excitement that you were getting on a day-to-day basis, right? And the fear of something's going wrong, and what if it doesn't happen? And then 6 months into it, when things are actually not working out, how do you keep the team's momentum? All of these changes start to come into picture. So I just want to kind of point it out. Transformation sounds big
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
way.
yeah.
Making it happen comes with its own set of challenges. Of course, when it starts paying out, it pays out big time. But
Yeah.
just pointing out both sides of it.
So, you've implemented some really big programs, and I know, especially we've helped you on the entire sales transformation piece with the intelligence hub and with the back office operations staff with the Axel Ops and all of that. My question is that how did you decide which areas to zone in on? How to go from 400 to 4, right? And what changed that sort of unlock for you?
So two things on that, just continuing on that thread, and exactly I think I went through the same uh, moment of crisis almost that Alyson was talking about, because you
Yeah.
start thinking, what happens when we do these 400? This coming, everything is good. At some point, I started imagining that what would my OKRs look like? What would we look like as an organization? And after
Let
those
me ask
400
that. Were the 400 use cases delivering value?
they were delivering value. They deliver a lot of individual productivities as they come through, right?
Yeah.
But it is exactly to what Alison said. It is sitting on top of an existing business model. So when you try to zoom out and think 2 years down the line with all of these in implementation, what would happen? And then you start realizing that we will get 20 to 30% more productive. That's most likely what would happen.
Uh-huh.
I could not imagine the business model shift. I could not imagine what it is that would start changing something for us fundamentally. And that is when we started to have those dialogues, with our CEO, our my boss, our CIO, all of us coming together and saying, look, we need to rethink this process, otherwise we will miss out on the benefits, right? So now the good part is, when you do it in this fashion, when you start rethinking, the one thing it makes the best impact is on ROI and the discussions with business leaders. Because when we were talking these use cases, then nobody knows what exactly to commit towards and what to get to. But when you say we are going to transform this entire process and this will become faster, create deeper experiences and things of that nature, the business leaders at least are able to start envisaging that at that point, what would it mean from an organization, from a productivity unlock perspective, from a value add and a better client experience perspective, from better investment process perspective. So that shift at least becomes easier to imagine. So we say, here's a big shift we'll do, and here's the ROI we'll try to get to. And then we started backtracking into how will we make it happen. And you guys were obviously a part of the journey, Pranay. So you know that.
So yeah, absolutely, and it's been very exciting and fun to do all of that stuff along with you, right? So I'm imagining the conversations inside, correct? Because let's say you've done this whole host of use cases, they're already delivering value, and now you said they're probably delivering 20%, 30%, whether that's cost savings or faster time to market or revenue enhancement. But now you're going out to the business and saying, listen, I am going to stop doing some of these, which are probably, still give productive and giving good results. But in place of that, I'm going to focus on these three. Uh, are you able to prove upfront that, actually that is going to drive a much higher level of ROI?
You
Or
are
do you have to
able,
go through that exercise? Yeah.
yeah, no, you're spot on. You're able to make the case for it. You're able to
Yeah.
articulate what it would do. You're not able to show it. And that is the gap between the use case versus this, right? Because all of a sudden you cannot show it, right? Not only you cannot show it, but more often than not, a few months down the line, literally in each of the areas that we worked on, we went through a massive downswing, because you were a few months in, so that excitement that yes, we can do something was over. The new capabilities had not really started kicking in, and there were a lot of things that were going wrong. So that is the phase when you're not able to fully articulate the benefit, or see
Yeah.
how exactly to be able to show that. So it was actually go through that challenging process. I mean, you've got to cut the noise out and go through it together.
Yep. Okay, and I'll just continuing on this stream back to you, Alyson. Like you spoke a lot about this concept of use case chasing. I think Deep alluded to it. It does happen because you can see the benefit. It's exciting, etc. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that as to why you think that happens, and and what is the mindset change that we need to make to move beyond proof of concept?
Yeah, of course. I think, it's easy to see why it happens because, this is new. Everyone's trying to figure it out and learn along the way. And, we've been taught in financial services firms for years to be thinking in an agile way and, to test and learn, right? And that's kind of
Yeah,
part of
yeah,
it. But I think, there does come to a point where some of the conversations I know that I'm having, because I have a lot of clients calling me up asking about use cases, which is great, but I don't know that it's quite the right question to be asking. It's because they've got executives saying, hey, what are we doing? We need to be doing something with AI. We've got to tell the board,
yeah,
we've got to tell the market, the share price will be hit if we're not telling the market we're doing something. We at least need, it feels like a scramble to be doing something. And
yeah,
of course, that's fine and gets you the, oh, wow, they're thinking about AI kind of hit in terms of, reputation and maybe share price or whatever. But already we're fast kind of seeing that shift to, well, that's great, but is it actually going to drive change? Now, right now, we're seeing the firms that are chasing use cases, not outcomes, really focusing on their ROI being about cost reduction and profitability, and productivity, right? And again, that's all fine for the short term, but you can only squeeze so much juice out of it, right? Over time, you're going to be looking for the market, and everyone is going to be looking for stronger ROI. They're going to be looking for transformation and revenue growth. I think proof of concepts really are optimized for feasibility, not necessarily business integration, and you get the operating model friction, right? Your risk, your legal, your data ownership, all of that kind of then slows your ability to scale. And you're potentially also doing things where you've got poor reusability of the data or decisioning foundations. They're not built to be able to be reused in multiple times. So you've got these success metrics around these proof of concepts and use cases that might be undermining your scaling decisions. I think it's really important that organizations shift their mindset. They shifted away from simply focusing only on cost reduction and utilization metrics to determine success, which is what we see a lot of, and shifting it to how do I tie it back to customer outcomes and business outcomes? How do I use it to maximize customer value and business value? And that's going to help create that shift, I think, towards thinking more towards kind of transformational ways to leverage the technology and what needs to happen in the organization, opposed to the kind of, smaller short-term use cases.
Yep, excellent. So I took away a few things from there, right? I think there was a message to boards as well over there, which is that focus on the big ticket programs and not on the number of programs, right? So I think that's very important. I think the questions that we ask on the board need to be, much more about focus and how we're making the big ticket changes.
And it's okay, by the way, it's okay to be doing some use case stuff. You want to think of it as a portfolio,
some experiments,
right?
yes, yeah.
Because it helps you experiment, it helps you learn, it keeps the momentum, it keeps the excitement, as Deep was talking about. But if you're not addressing and investing resources and so forth into the more transformation and stuff, you're going to be behind fast in terms of where the market's going and the competition's going. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And I think therefore the second point was that, the experimentation and agility should not undermine scalability. Because we're talking about large enterprises, and it's only with scalability that we'll realize the full value.
Yeah.
I think the third point was about, not just focus on cost and productivity, also in revenue and, customer experience. And I have to say that in our work with several of the Fortune 500s, we're seeing a lot of focus around revenue and customer experience and, new product innovation, all of that stuff. So that's stuff that, we're seeing, and we're finding that quite exciting and encouraging.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, and this is an interesting consumer lens on this, right? Some firms that say that they're focusing on revenue, it really is focusing on using data and insights to better target for the next product sale. And that's really what it's focused on. That's not long-term revenue growth. That's like a revenue point of sale now. The challenge is if you start to build these things with AI and you push customers away from talking to humans, just take the scenario where, we're not just using AI inside the organization, we're using it externally in conversational AI with customers. One of the challenges that happens is customers are being given AI to do stuff, pay bills, move money, open an account. That is not going to create long-term sustainable loyalty and a customer base that's willing to pay a price premium for your services. Not over the long term, when everybody starts to get those kind of table stakes things. We saw this with digital transformation and digital banking. When everybody got their digital banking and digital mobile apps kind of up to par, it's no longer a differentiator in loyalty. And so I think, when I talk about long-term revenue, I'm not just talking about a better way to flog more products and a more efficient way to flog products. Sorry about my Australianism language there, but I'm thinking also about how do you use this to anticipate customer needs? How do you use this to build product solutions, not just transactional and transaction type and traditional products? How are you creating services and experiences that not just add value to your business, but add value to your customers, such that you get to know your customers better over time through personalization? Because if you know your customers better over time, because you're having better interactions, not just more product sales with them, and you have more information and data because they trust you more and they're willing to share that with you, that creates a competitive edge that's really hard for competitors to come in and replicate. They can come in on price, but they don't know you as well as, perhaps the existing firm that you're with. And so I do think about revenue more broadly than just how do I sell more product. I think a bit about how do you create better experiences that are more deeply engaging for customers, that are helping know customers, helping customers build trust with you, and building that long-term loyalty that makes it really, really hard for competitors to come in and steal away.
Excellent. You preempted my next question, right, which was really about, how do financial services companies win? But I think what I'm taking away is that really the focus on longer term customer retention, customer service and value creation, translating to longer term value for the organization. So let me, Deep, get your view on this, right? From the side of, Franklin Templeton, where do you see the strongest opportunities for AI to improve customer or advisor experience? Both are, very, very important aspects of your business. So And how do you see that without it becoming personalization that is only self-serving?
Yeah, prior to your point, I think you're spot on, and Alison, you mentioned that, but I'll just hone in on that part that, the value comes from doing something which is significantly different, right, with the existing capabilities. Now, what is that significant difference? In financial space, you would see almost two different kinds of capabilities, right? One, super sophisticated capabilities that are being accessed only by high net worth clients or larger institutions, and those are the ones who are getting the best exposure to the right kind of assets, a full level of diversification, a complete understanding what those portfolios could mean for them. And then on the other side, you see a lot of what are almost like mass market products, which are super simplified and allow you to quickly put your money in. They kind of take care of, and many, lots of individuals get pulled into one single model, and those kind of things that tend to happen, right? So
Yep.
that's the split in the divide that you see.
Yep.
When you start redoing this entire value chain, in the way investment management happens, right from the investment research, investment decisions, and portfolio and product creation to trades, settlements, and eventually to portfolio advice that happens at the wealth management level, in this entire value chain, there are a lot of inefficiencies built in, right? Those inefficiencies start to go away. And what that effectively means is that now you can create extremely sophisticated capabilities, but at much lower price points and with much better accessibility, um, you know, across the board. So that shift where, as an industry, I always think that financial industry is a little bit like what doctors are to healthy clients.
Yeah.
We cater to the ones who really, can really make it happen.
Yeah.
That needs to shift, right? There's no reason why this industry cannot cater to everybody and with the right
Yeah.
level of personalization and the right level of sophistication that an individual needs at different points in time. So that requires a full rewiring. It's not just making things easier and simpler, it also requires the digital mechanisms for people to access information, to be able to take the right decisions, for them to flow back. In many cases, FT in particular is also focused a lot towards digital assets and then trying to rewire that entire underlying systems that can really help even improve the transaction mechanism. Right. So there's a lot of that opportunity. That's what I feel that we can do over the long run if we get this right.
I
Excellent.
would
Excellent.
I was just going to say, I think the other thing too, and I don't know if you're seeing this too, Deep, is that it can actually help shift towards anticipatory personalization, right?
Mhm.
I think many organizations, when they think about personalization, uh, it is very much around reactive personalization to data they've seen in the past and things that have happened, or it's about what's the next offer to put in front of a client. But really, by leveraging, some of the technologies available and the modeling and so forth, you can start to actually anticipate customer needs. And, particularly in that advice space, I would see that as being, absolutely, crucial to kind of longer term success. Are you thinking about anticipatory advice and anticipatory personalization at scale in your, business?
I think it's a great point, Edison, and you're spot on because what this allows us to do is I think along with Pranay's team we have done a lot in the goals-based wealth management space as an example. And what you can do is you can get a really good understanding of what your clients are looking for, because it's very tough for clients themselves to be able to express the right level of risk and what we should be modeling towards, right? So with these capabilities that have started to come in, you can start anticipating for them both as individuals as well as for those cohorts, and what does it mean from a risk perspective for them. So that space, there's a lot that we can do, and you're spot on that the more these capabilities are getting more digital in nature, that is increasing the level of data sets that are getting available, and then it puts you on that right flywheel, where more information allows you to think about them in the right way.
At Fractal, as an example, what we say is that the way AI transformation plays out is number one in helping develop new products faster and better that meet the customer's need. Number two, helping organizations reduce the friction in customer engagement, just improving the quality of customer engagement, whether that's in terms of communication or it's in terms of product availability, servicing, and so on. Number three is driving operational efficiencies, which translate to profitability benefits but also as you said, it would remove friction and make the customer experience smoother and better, right? Four is really just in terms of, I would say, creating disruption, right? That you are leading and creating some disruption and not being the one that gets disrupted. And then fifth, and you mentioned it, Deep, which is that making data and insights available very easily to all decision makers so that they can drive decision making, right? So I think, in a sense, that would be the full AI transformation for the organization. So with that, I want to move to the next part of this, which is around metrics and creating the foundations for driving AI-based transformation. So you, Alyson, you said one of the biggest blockers is measuring the wrong metrics, right? It could be only around cost reduction or productivity and so on, right? So what metrics should we organizations start focusing on? How should they sort of try to drive that board downwards to enable real transformation?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different types of metrics as you kind of move along your journey, right? So as you're starting to build things out, you want to be measuring how reusable are your AI assets, right, across the organization, be it things around identity resolution, intent detection, risk prediction, decision orchestration. Can you reuse this? So is it going to help you and speed up your transformation? You also want to be measuring the success and ability of treating data pipelines and models as shared enterprise infrastructure, not as project artifacts, right? So if you are creating these data sets and models and they're only being used once, again, that's not really going to set you up for transformative success. So I think there's some sort of metrics around this to help, again, set up the right behaviors and approach to lead into this transformation we talked about earlier. And then in terms of the ROI, I think you want to be thinking about business KPIs and customer KPIs. So, how is the AI actually helping you drive business value and customer value? What are the outcomes for the business and the outcomes for customers that are being measured? And, back to some of the things that I talked about earlier, is what you're doing helping you create customers that are more loyal? So they're more likely to stay with you, more likely to deepen their share of wallet with you, more likely to pay a premium for your products and services, because that starts to get at a kind of outcome from your business of creating this really lovely kind of long-term sustainable loyal customer base, and if customers are seeing value from what you're doing, but it also helps you kind of map that back to business value like product sales and efficiency and costs and those sorts of things as well. But I really do think that from a metrics perspective, you want to be thinking I think more at the system level rather than the use case. There are some things along the way with the use cases and about how they're built and the reusability of stuff that should be measured. But at the end of the day, it's tying it back to what you're trying to achieve as a business and how successful it is in helping you achieve the business outcomes. But equally, you want customer metrics and customer outcomes as well.
So you spoke of two kinds of outcomes. One is I would say, the infrastructure scalability metrics, reusability metrics.
And you're learning along the journey and building that muscle around doing that and that shift from use cases to more enterprise transformation.
So so as you think of, this AI becoming central to strategy and we need scalability. So what does a strong data foundation and infrastructure foundation look like for you to enable this transformation at scale?
First things first, since we are talking the entire transformation, and as Alyson was mentioning, there's a lot about those customer KPIs, as well as business KPIs that you're thinking about. And then when you're layering in transformation, I think the big shift that happens for the data system is that first thing is that the amount of data usage and the amount of calls to the data system, they spike significantly, right? And it's very different when humans are making those calls and asking for that information. And it's very different when AI systems are asking for that information. The scale, the scope, the speed of differences, the kind of questions that are being asked, everything starts to change. So now the pressure that is being exerted on the data foundations is radically different than 3 years back. when it was a set of humans and they were getting a set of dashboards and saying, I like this, but I need to add one more thing on top of this. Completely different from that. It's a completely different paradigm, right? So that does require a much better harnessing of the data at source. So Vasu, who is our head of platforms, she's very passionate about what she calls as the data agents. Every data source can be an agent in itself, right? So not only is it a source, but it is able to talk about everything that's happening on its data side with other agents in a very agile fashion, if you can train it right. Now that's a non-trivial job, by the way, right? But once you get it right, so now what happens is you've got a foundation where there's a bunch of data sources, each of them which are way more conversational and which can really articulate and shift. But then you're bringing them, by the way, both structured and unstructured sets of data into common layers and are now able to start creating a much more agile way of how you are able to distribute that, right? So that transformation that is happening at that centralized layer where all of these data sets are coming together and interacting with each other, it's a new paradigm. But I think the benefit that I see with that new paradigm coming in is that it can, the way it is transforming the business processes. This is the part where you cannot do by just putting an LLM on top of systems and say that, what, an LLM will figure it out and everything will happen. It is the intelligence is actually getting embedded in the data systems. They are not just outputs, but they are themselves sources of, new sets of intelligence systems.
Excellent. Great. So very, very, very interesting. The new paradigm of the data and data foundations itself. Now, one of the risks, at least that we have seen in the past, is, you've both spoken of scalability and transformation and not chasing the use cases, and not, the agility should not come in the way of scalability. But equally, we've seen the flip side as well, which is that you've gone out and that companies have gone out and built a set of, data infrastructure and purchased a lot of models and compute and all of that, with no real clarity on how they'll deploy that. Right, so they prepared the systems to be scalable, but what do we scale, right? How do you avoid that? Because that is equally a risk, right? As much as use case chasing is.
So I think with what you're saying that, yes, just like use case chasing, if I'm getting it right, Pranay, just for me to understand, what you're saying is that the innovation, like, you would have the flip side of this, which is that is in the old digital spaces, there was a lot of focus on labs, and capabilities.
No, I'm talking more about chasing infrastructure and chasing tools and getting the foundations ready. But now you've got a lot of infrastructure ready,
Right.
and not enough applications.
Yeah, and which is where I was kind of saying that, as you do a lot of that infrastructure and that time what used to happen was that these three things, the foundations, the innovation, and the businesses, these three capabilities more often than not were a bit more siloed from each other, right?
Yeah.
And that is what was leading. So, for example, when you're going through the whole digital transformation, what you would say is, we will build this new foundation. And by the way, here are these labs and researchers, which will do this moonshot stuff, and that will become the source of consumption and so on. And once everything gets together, then we'll see how this comes into business value. I think where the things are starting to shift is that these three things are getting way more dynamically connected. If you can get the process right up front, you can say, here's the business case I'm chasing. Here is the way I'm thinking of the rewiring. Here's the way I'm thinking of the data sets coming. And all these three things can happen in a much faster, leaner cycle connected with each other versus the much longer times. And so I'm not expecting that you start building the data foundations. You expect them to be an integral part of the transformation process where the process is demanding that. As that is happening, your foundations are constantly shifting. And by the way, new innovative ways of coming are, almost, happening in tandem to that. So that's where I think I differ a bit.
I think also, this leads into governance. I think, and some of the importance of governance, and I know we were going to talk about that. I think that this is where it's really important that you have clear accountability for outcomes, not just models, for example, right? So as the business starts to adopt those models and leverage them across the organization for particular outcomes, if you don't have accountability for the outcomes and you've only got accountability for the models, that's going to impact things. I think guardrails around autonomy, explainability, and escalation also play a real factor here as well as kind of helping drive this transformation. And thinking about continuously monitoring, not just kind of one-time approvals for stuff. And the last thing kind of ties back to something I mentioned earlier about thinking in a transformative way is about connecting, risk appetite to CX to, other things across the organization. So I think getting that alignment across those particular areas, and across, your risk reduction, your compliance, your customer experience aspirations, that's what's really going to kind of help transform. And so I think, governance plays a role with this and how you do it. And the wrong governance might, that myopic focus might actually impede more scalable transformation as well.
It's an excellent point. I think the governance and the planning that becomes really important because a big part of that governance element would be visualizing and agreeing to an end state, which means that this is the transformation that's going to take place, and therefore these are the use cases for the transformation, and these are the foundations that are required for that. And that's a great point. So let me push the Deep, any comments from your side on the governance aspect? And I'm going to get to my final question after that.
Okay, no, I think completely agree with that, with everything that Alyson said. I think the only thing I will add to it is that this governance then has to get embedded in the process. So it's very important that you're not thinking about it as a retrospective or as a much more centralized capability, which is from the transformation. We've got to embed it right up front.
Okay, excellent, great. So, and let me throw it out, Alyson, you first, and then Deep. As you're looking around you, where are you seeing innovation coming from? What are the sources of innovation that are leading to real change or real transformation in this industry?
I think in terms of AI, where everyone's focus is around innovation, I think there's a couple of things going on. We have a lot of traditional firms that are becoming what I call AI powered. But to be honest, that's really just AI as an add-on, right? They're using it to improve things like customer service or risk management. It's not really embedded in the core architecture. On the other side of things, we see new fintechs launching, right? So from the ground up. And, they're either being built AI first, where you've got AI in the core architecture, it's embedded in the systems, it's driving personalization, it's driving it's driving risk and ops automation and many different things across the organization. And then you've also got some very advanced fintechs that are starting to launch that are fully autonomous, where you've got agents autonomously executing tasks without any human intervention. And, the organization isn't even hiring anybody other than coders. We have, there's a firm called Buburuza that's just launched that's doing that, right? And so we're starting to see, I think, the real transformative innovation will, like all these things, come around from the fintech side, because they'll build from the ground up, they'll build differently, and they think differently. They've got the white space to be able to do that, and the tech stack that doesn't exist to be able to do that and build that. You've got incumbents that might create some innovation around the edge. And so, there will be what I call fast mover innovations. We saw this in digital banking, right? Those that launched mobile apps first were seen as innovative, but really quickly everybody caught up. So I think, most of the innovation and true transformative innovation we see is likely to come from non-traditional firms. We'll see step change stuff from traditional firms, and the question will be whether they can truly move into that transformative environment, or whether they're just going to buy and have two operating models, right? One for the big customer base and the digital bank offshoot, or the AI bank offshoot, for example, and potentially end up in this two-speed market, both competing for the same customers, which is a challenge. But I think, if we look at innovation, particularly in financial services, quite often what we see is the sexy, interesting innovation coming from the fintechs, the kind of slow, scalable, slightly transformative innovation will come from a few leaders in financial services, but in the main, I think they will be struggling to keep up and catch up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And Deep, I know that you disagree with this, so let's hear your point of view.
Yes, listen, I definitely beg to differ on this one. We align on many things, perhaps not on this one. Look, I don't think, and I do see where this comes from because, Alyson, as you rightly pointed out, there's a whole process of digital transformation for years, which I think a lot of legacy firms did not really take full advantage of, right?
Yeah.
But I do feel that what AI changes and where this value comes in, first off, a lot of AI innovation did not necessarily come from smaller firms. It actually came from a lot of bigger firms, right? From whether it was the theoretical foundational papers in these that brought a lot of today's AI into
I guess
picture.
I'm thinking more about the model, the transformative model innovation change and product stuff as opposed to the AI innovation. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to kind of point out that, I just say that, it's a game where there's a lot of people who come into picture. I think where AI in particular is good for legacy firms if they can act on it. And there's an important element of it. I do agree that not all will become leaders, and this may become a fairly polarized market within the legacy firms. But the firms which get it right, they can unlock a lot of value. The legacy systems, which tend to be a burden, they are also massive sources of knowledge. So what these huge legacy systems sitting inside these legacy organizations have, they have stored a lot of that contextual knowledge that you can start unlocking as you get these systems. And what you end up with is if you get it right, you can end up with giant trained systems that really get the entire organization's know-how and you can bring it out in the market. To be able to do that unlock, you need a select few partners. You don't need the old SaaS model to really get it right for you. That is the other big shift that's happening. And and again, Pranay, we worked on some of this together.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
you can use a small team to really create massive applications that can actually intelligent applications that can cut through and run through the organization and really start piecing some of those together. So that shift in the SaaS model, which was another big bottleneck for legacy firms to take full control of that, you see a big shift happening on that front as well, right? And at the end of it, a lot of it is what intelligence means, right? And if intelligence means that stored bodies of knowledge that you've had for 50 years, 60 years, 100 years,
yeah.
it just depends on how do you train them, how do you unlock them, and you start creating value out of it. So that's where I guess we continue to
But
differ.
interestingly, no, I don't disagree. I actually don't disagree with you. I agree with everything that you said. And the glass half full optimist in me says that would be amazing. And I agree with the foundational. And I believe we will see a few standout firms, probably Franklin Temple is one of them, that will then use all of that to achieve some really innovative and transformative change to business models and what they're doing and all that sort of stuff. But 90 to 95% of organizations, if history repeats itself as it keeps doing in these organizations, the silos in the organization, the scattered data, again, that's still in silos that even now are having they're having issues mining. If the investments are not made in the data infrastructure that's necessary, if the investments aren't made in the cultural and organizational change and mindset of thinking about the customer and customer journeys opposed to products and transactions, then they will not extract the true value and innovation transformation from that shift. So I don't disagree with everything you said, and the glass half full in me wants to believe that will happen. But I've been around long enough to know that that's not always the case. I believe we'll get a few outliers where it will happen. And I think the fintechs will build interesting things, but you're right, they might not initially have the deep of knowledge and data, but that's where open banking and open finance comes into play if the US can finally get its act together on it. And that's where things can really start to supercharge outside of those traditional firms. And I completely get the traditional firms see that as a threat, but globally, open banking, open finance, open data starts to enable that knowledge and data sharing to build some of that stuff as well. So that's why I see this kind of two-speed market evolving. And I don't think all of the traditional firms are going to end up in that innovation. There'll be some, and hopefully Franklin Templeton is one of them.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that part of you. That not all traditional firms will get it. I am doing a lot of in my own dissertation. I'm analyzing a lot of these different firms. Which I'm working on, and so on. And you see that gap, that firms which get it, firms which don't, and that gap continues to extend and magnify over time. Because it requires a lot. It requires more than just technology. It requires the people. It requires the mindset, an ability to fail and shift. So firms which have not harnessed that culture, they will struggle with that. And I do expect that it will become a fairly polarized world. So we'll see how that plays out. I'm fairly sure that we'll be in the pole position, but we can't let our guard down on this for sure.
True.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you both very much. This was a fantastic conversation, lively back and forth, and some points of agreement, some points of disagreement, but that's how we learn and move forward. So thank you both very much. Really appreciate the discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pranay. Thanks, Alyson. Great talking to you guys.